Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be finishing up the last little bit of our historically accurate Winifred Sanderson ensemble. And I am joined today by Sippet, who is not my dog, but she really wanted to be part of this, and she seems thematically appropriate. Now, the last few pieces that I'm going to be working on are the least historically accurate of the grouping. They are things that really sort of take this from being a historical garment to being a cosplay. So first we're going to start with the stomacher. Now, while stomachers are historically accurate to the late 17th century, they're not 100% necessary when it comes to mantuas. Some styles will meet up in the front, others will just simply have the stays showing underneath, which is how I wore it in the last video. But I decided that an embroidered stomacher would be the perfect way to get to incorporate some more interesting and iconic imagery from the movie. We'll be moving on to styling all of the wigs, and finally I have a few other accessory pieces that I wanted to put together, and there's some fun research with those that I accidentally came across, and they were a bit fortuitous. So let's get into the last little bit of sewing and preparations before we get to run amok. I did first look to 17th century stomachers to see what sort of designs and layout and embroidery methods they used. A lot of them had weaving vines and other natural forms on them. Some had gold work or silver work. Others had a great deal of silk embroidery. So there was a very large variety not only of motifs, but of the methods used as well. So I decided that this would be the perfect place to take a little bit of historical liberty. I went back and used Winifred's book as the inspiration for my embroidery design. So it's a very interesting piece. One of its main motifs are the snakes nestled in the corners and wrapped around the latchet. It also has, of course, the infamous great big eye in the middle of the latch. Now, eyeballs are certainly an embroidery motif back in the 17th century, though I haven't found an example of one on a stomacher. The same thing goes for snakes. There are certainly embroidered snakes in different pieces around that time period, but I hadn't seen that specifically done on a stomacher either. But it wasn't a huge leap, and I thought that they would fit into that space absolutely perfectly, and it'd be a great way to incorporate some little bits from the movie. Once I actually had the design put together and got to the embroidery, I was mostly using what I had in stock. I didn't necessarily want to go and purchase a lot of gold or silver thread for this, and I happened to have a good amount of stuff left over from previous projects. So when I was working on the snakes, the silver thread that I was using was not ideal. It's a bit too rough and it's not nearly heavy enough. But it did end up with a very lovely design for that reason. The particular stitch that I chose for doing the snakes is accurate to the 17th century. The eyeball was done at the combination of gold threads and silk embroidery, and when it came to the rest of the fill-in for the spider webs and some of the seams that I put in akin to the book, I was using a woven metal braid, which is more of a modern embroidery technique, but is not too far off from different metal braids that you would have seen historically. All in all, the embroidery design was fairly sparse just due to the amount of time and supplies that I had. It could have been encrusted with far more, but I think it really gets the effect across, and in reality the book itself is fairly plain even for all the decor that is on it, and I didn't want to necessarily go so overboard that you couldn't actually see the main part of the design. The final accessory that I chose to add was that of a few silk hoods. So I thought this would be a perfect time to use up a few scraps of silk that I had and add in a little bit more of their signature colors. What I did not expect when I was researching silk hoods was that they would have their own witchy history. Interestingly enough, luxury fabrics, such as silks, were something that were fairly controversial in the late 17th century in the New England area. And Massachusetts itself had actually passed some sumptuary laws in the 1670s discussing, specifically, silk hoods. 16-year-old Hannah Lyman was actually called to be in front of the magistrates for wearing a silk hood when she was both too young and not nearly wealthy enough to be doing so. The best part is that Hannah wore her silk hood to court. As a response, she was fined 10 shillings for this, but I think we can all agree that might actually be worth it in this circumstance. One of the most interesting parts of this is that when we go to look at the Salem witch trials, they do actually mention silk hoods and silk mantles as one of the items of evidence against some of the women that were accused. In fact, they specified that when the devil appeared to young women, he was expected to offer them silks. Wearing fine clothes, such as silk hoods, was something that was incredibly dubious. So I unexpectedly ended up making the perfect garments for the Sanderson sisters. For the wigs, I wanted to go with historically accurate hairstyles. Now, the wigs themselves are not technically historically accurate in the fact that they are modern wigs, and in reality, in the late 17th century, wigs were not nearly as common as people wearing their own hair and just simply adding hair pieces to augment what they needed. However, I nor the two other friends that I was working with have the correct color or length of hair to actually accommodate what needs to happen, so we were going with wigs and a few hair pieces added into those instead. I tried to find hairstyles that were reminiscent of the ones from the movie. Surprisingly, that is not nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. Mary's in particular is very unusual. It sort of peaks up at the top and curls over, akin to a very tall, what we consider witch hat today. Obviously, this is not something that is historically accurate, so I chose instead to find a hairstyle that was a bit peaked in the middle, and ended up with something that had two large barrel rolls that peaked in the center. The rest of the hairstyle I filled in with curls in the back and some hair down around the neck. For Sarah, I wanted to go with something a bit more loose and unfinished. She seemed very much like a Nell Gwyn sort of character, and while Nell Gwyn was a few years out of date, it just seemed appropriate to go with something that wasn't nearly as tightly curled or extreme in its structure. So I used very loose curls and kept it very soft and simple. Now, I found Winifred's hair to be the most interesting style, in no small part due to the fact that it is actually barely historically accurate. It is a little bit out of date by the time we reach the 1693 point that opens the movie. It's closer to the 1670s or even early 1680s, but it's really not that far out of date, all things considered. All I had to do to sort of bring it up to fashion was to simply change the overall shape of the hair. Instead of it being wide at the sides, I simply moved more of the fullness towards the center of the top, and I let some of the hair down and back, as was fashionable at the time. I kept all of the curly hair as it was. There are so many examples of curly or frizzy hair during this time period as a very fashionable style, so there was no need for me to make any drastic changes to Winifred's hair. And with that last piece finished up, we are ready to start putting everything together and get to the fun part. Now, as I mentioned last week, I do have a couple of guest stars coming and offering their assistance in this. I do have to specify ahead of time that though I was able to take 2 months to put together this Winifred Sanderson costume, the same is not true for Mary and Sarah, for obvious reasons. So they are both made up of historically accurate pieces pulled from my closet that somehow, miraculously, happen to be character appropriate. But in the case of Sarah, she's about 15 years too early, and in the case of Mary, she's about 15 years too late. So they're not too far off, and considering the circumstances, I'm pretty proud of what we managed to put together. So I invite you along on our night of mischief.
young again!
Well, younger, but it's a start!
Costumes and run amok! Amok!
Oh, Winnie. Just one child.
That boy! He tricked us again!
You're always right.
That's my curse! That and you too! Oh, get off of me, you wandering oafs! That's not happening!
I don't think the getting up is so much
No.
thing.
Nope, that's fine.
Justice, we're just here.
Just we live here now.
1 million years later. Some little children were stuck on the ground. Can't get up to eat our pizza.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, there was with my wig.